people as either a result of the stage of semester, the weather issues that are ongoing that have prevented people from attending in person, perhaps because of train disruptions. I know that that has affected people this week, particularly today in another class. However, I hope it doesn't signify a lack of interest in this topic, because this topic is actually building on previous weeks that, to be sure, some of them were made available, the lectures, in recorded format, because many people cannot attend because of class clashes. And I can only assume that you've actually been following up. Some people, of course, have been here in person. So what we're examining today carries on our discussions in relation to the politics of territory, but in a different political climate and in a different geopolitical context, that is in Mexico. So if you followed up the links for today's topic, you'll see a little bit of a summary. It's quite a chunky text, I know, but it helps to orientate it a little bit. And we have three particular projects, I should say: the Tren Maya, which has been authorized and has already gone ahead in Mexico from the time of writing of this, to the Trans-Isthmus Corridor in Oaxaca. So the Tren Maya crosses the Yucatán Peninsula and various states in Mexico, and the Trans-Isthmus Corridor is a proposal to connect to, it's basically an interoceanic corridor as an alternative to the Panama Canal, to supposedly be competitive for trade. And the Proyecto Integral Morelos, which features a gas pipeline and a hydroelectric plant that impacts communities in 3 states. And this is all under the period of time that we'll be examining today, from 2018 onwards, of the presidency of Andrés Manuel López Obrador, AMLO. So just as a prep for today, the suggestion had been, if we go back one tab, that you perhaps do a bit of background on the topic by looking at some readings. We have 3 readings that are suggested. Mariano Sanchez Talenquer's Mexico 2019, Personalistic Politics and Neoliberalism from the Left. Now, this is very interesting, right? Because AMLO, really, his program culminates and comes into being electorally, gets a lot of support from being framed as leftist and being touted as post-neoliberal. And of course, Mexico is not alone in this kind of strange conjuncture. It is also something that we've noted in the case of Ecuador under Rafael Correa, for example, in the first decade of the 20th century. This appeal to the left, to being representative of the left, perhaps even absorbing elements of the left into a populist program. Mexico, of course, had never been notionally included within the category of the pink tide that I spoke about a couple of weeks ago, but now seems poised to have the main party, Morena, a leftist coalition, be re-elected, and that is in the mid part of this year, so very soon. And whomever gains the presidency is going to be a woman, that much we know. But it seems as if his successor will be from his same party, because Morena still has that very broad-based support. So there's that article about the personalistic politics of AMLO. And that just provides a bit of background. And the way in which he sort of alienated other segments of the left, what we might call desde abajo, from below, the left from below, not the formal political left, but those organizations that represent such things as struggles over territory, yeah, and to either stall or prevent extractivist operations on land. And so the other 2 readings relate to different forms of extractivism and how they sort of get dressed up as well, clean development or development of possession. And this takes in the political economy of wind parks in southern Mexico, more precisely the isthmus. So isthmus is a sort of area of land. If you imagine Spain and Morocco, they're connected by what's known as an isthmus. It's a very narrow stretch of land, but because of its location, it is an extremely windy area. So one would think that it'd be very propitious to be able to set up wind farms, yeah, to generate so-called clean energy. But the investment in this area and the contention over the use of that land, particularly of Zapotec peoples, is to set up wind farms, and the energy generated from it would be sold on the world market and would not be of benefit necessarily to community. And as a further reading, there's Alessandro Moresin's Comunalidad, Gendaliza, and anti-mine mobilizations in the Isthmus, which I just referred to, of Oaxaca, that's known as the Isthmus of Tehuantepec. So there's a number of questions to pause on, particularly in regard to the Hesketh clean development or development of dispossession reading, and also Moresin's, which is more centered on different forms of defensive resistance around mining in an area of Oaxaca, actually, that has not been characteristically the center of mining projects, but latterly, it seems that there's a lot of land grabs and attempts to get into the southern part of Oaxaca to do this. We have a whole lot of other readings that if this area of research interests you, you can also tap into. That wasn't expected for today, but there's also a backgrounder, one of the few online sources in English that's available that tackles the fronts of Indigenous resistance in this eco-territorial turn to AMLO in Mexico. Not much material of this nature is currently available, critical analysis as well. So I do encourage you, if this is something you want to pick up on, if you're not in the lecture today, to have a listen to that particular video interview. It's a few years old now, but these mega projects, as they know, are still the site of much contention. So that's just the introductory bit for what materials are available up online and why I put so much up there, particularly when you're thinking about what you're going to focus on in your essay portfolio. This may inspire you. So let's move now to presentation. And in this presentation, I have a number of images as well, but I've named it New Hegemonies, but also Counter Hegemonies. And this is to play on the idea that the state sort of masses legitimacy on both discursive and material bases, particularly as they're framed within the national interest. So, for example, AMLO's populist, supposedly post-neoliberal development turn versus the counter forces of the Frentes Populares in Mexico and asambleas, that typical governance structure that one finds within Indigenous communities that do not just fold into the state and the state's projections on the national territory. So one form of development, which is touted as post-neoliberal, but is actually neo-extractivist, supposedly in the interest of providing jobs, generating economic growth in the country, versus alternative visions of development from a community basis, from actually the kinds of political ontologies that I spoke to last week as well, of worlds otherwise. So it's not disconnected from last week's lecture, which is a bit of a foray into thinking about political worlds otherwise, and also notions of development here otherwise, which we'll get into. But the first image is quite striking. It's a bit blurry because I've expanded it, but we have the portrait of the revolutionary Emiliano Zapata. Okay, so Mexico, to give a bit of history, underwent a revolution, the world's first 20th century revolution. People seem to forget that, and they pay attention to the 1917 revolution in Russia under the Bolsheviks. But actually, that was preceded by a much more violent, but also potentially revolutionary turn in Mexico that was very much posited on land and land rights, to dismantle the oligarchic structure that made Indigenous peasants into peons in a form of kind of republican feudalism that also repressed dissent. And what occurred with the revolution of 1910, sometimes posited as happening until 1920, is that we saw various fronts of people such as Zapata from Morelos, from the state of Morelos, emerging to contest in that political climate for the deposing of an oligarchic president by the name of Porfirio Diaz, who came to power swearing that he would not be re-elected, that he would respect democracy, but successively stayed within power by holding elections whereby he was constantly returned, like over about 3 decades, and really consolidated his power as a strong man over the country. But the Mexican Revolution is a defining moment because it really shakes the foundations of that oligarchy, forces eventually the dictator into hiding. But the popular bases of support, particularly, were manifest in the emblem and the message of Emiliano Zapata, who said, the earth is that the earth belongs to he or she who works it, who works the land. Yeah, la tierra es de quien la trabaja. And this has been very powerful. And you might actually notice that Zapata, the surname, latterly gives rise to Zapatismo. So that's where they gain their inspiration from too, as a kind of return to this, because it's an unfinished project. The revolution itself was kind of domesticated and led to the formation of what we know as the PRI, the Partido Revolucionario Institucional, which formed in 1929, and consolidated itself as the hegemonic party for some 71 years. And so popular energies such as those represented by Zapata or even Pancho Villa as well, another national hero, both of whom were actually assassinated because of the political contests and rivalries for power in the vacuum that was left from the deposing of the oligarch, resulted in the suppression of those popular energies, or the attempt to build a state, a post-revolutionary national state that would somehow domesticate or try to channel those demands. That's known as a corporatist state, right? And obviously Lucia walked us through that a little bit in relation to Egypt. So some comparisons can be made. But the Zapatistas latterly take up on this image of rebellion, and also the philosophy of Zapata, who himself was indigenous, but from the state of Morelos. And so we can see here historical memory plays out very significantly, doesn't it? In images and murals, as a form of political education and for people to be able to identify with, especially those involved in popular and land defense struggles. Zapata is a very important figure. So last week we talked about the centrality of anti-mining in indigenous and Afro-descendant movements. We also sought to think about land and territory as a space of a multiplicity of meanings, processes, and struggles. So this is not a vast audience here. I won't necessarily raise the question during the how or which, but we did draw on the work of some Halvorsen and his rethinking from a non-European lens of the meanings of tierra and territorio and how they're being remade within Yala, Latin America, precisely in these sorts of spaces of struggle. So this week we are turning to socio-environmental conflict, eco-territorial struggles in Mexico, and obviously land and territory are of equal importance, particularly for those fronts, and assemblies, what some call local subterranean struggles that have multiplied across the Republic. And this is even before the rise of Andrés Manuel López Obrador, AMLO, as we call him, and his Morena party to power, right? But we're going to be putting it within that particular conjuntura because it is the one that concerns us, particularly with those mega projects. And here we must speak, I suppose, of this new conjuncture, right? So when I first started to think about this and see the dynamics playing out, it was when Andrés Manuel López Obrador, AMLO, when he first came to power. And I was actually in Mexico City when the election was held, and then he won, and like everyone had so many hopes for him because effectively he seemed to be from outside of the political mainstream. He'd been contesting to try to be elected for a number of years with a kind of background of political alternation between two parties that people were becoming increasingly dissatisfied with, and I'll go into that in a little bit, but particularly because what was seen as being their forms of corruption, the way in which combating even narco trade just generated new cycles of violence, and also complicity between the state and the drug traffickers in the country. So he came to power to say, we're going to do away with all of this. We're going to bring justice, including for those who have been disappeared within the very internecine conflict that has played out over territories through the war on drugs, right? Which, to be sure, is not just involving Mexico, right? But Mexico is an epicenter for that, and had been from the time of Felipe Calderón, who preceded Andrés Manuel López Obrador, and basically initiated that war on drugs in line with the United States. So, but in this new potential opening of anti-corruption, of leading by connection to the people, el pueblo, and promising to deliver Mexico back to Mexico, and not just foreign interests, Manuel López Obrador really set this kind of moral tone that a lot of people appealed to because they were fed up. They felt that the previous governments had not only generated violence, but transgressed in so many ways, like actual rule of law. He also made a pledge to create social programs, and in their name, the politics of extractivism is very much premised, such as we saw in the case of Ecuador under Rafael Correa, and even Bolivia. In this left turn, yeah, the excuse of sacrificing territory, regardless of autonomies that are pre-existing or forms of cultural and land recognition, in favor of the so-called national interest. So Manuel López Obrador represents a new opening, an alternation from the previous two dominant parties, which he criticizes being part of the mafia del poder, the mafia of power, and positioned himself outside of, because his party, Morena, rose from social movement energies that were in opposition to those parties that had basically since the 2000 turn to democracy in Mexico, when the dominant party lost power and the turn was to PAN, continued to sort of rule, yeah, and run roughshod over democratic processes. So let's just consider a little bit before going more into the political dimensions of this new period and what it might have inherited as well from previous periods, the discourses of those involved in socio-environmental struggles. Very often they use phraseology that is direct, that can be understood by anyone, and they posit that their struggles are for life, that they're against the politics of death, because many forms of both literal and material, so territorial and material dispossession, for them represent the death of a way of life, a death of their worlds. They struggle against the imposition of models of development upon local forms of economy and governance. The place of territory as a space of economic life-giving activities and cooperation, collective work, is emphasized. In this, they demand a respect for horizontal and properly administered processes of consultation should any kinds of forms of extractive activity take place. Informed consent, which we've heard about already, including within our tutorial last week, proper environmental impact assessment processes, and benefits to the community. Yeah, within these particular mega projects. So mega projects are those large-scale, super infrastructural forms of whether they be mining or energy extraction by the way of the building of dams, establishing gas fields, and harnessing energy by the sowing of supposedly renewable forms of energy, such as monocrops that are then used as biofuel. There's a number of ways in which there's a number of faces of extractivism, but they all involve land, right? So land defense, being a defender, means being engaged in defensive resistance. That is not just in relation to if an operation such as a mining operation has already been established, but before it can happen in the first place. So this goes back to week, I think, 2, where we contemplated Southern movements as being not just on the defenses, but on the offensive. That is, that they calculate the possible risks, obviously, but also the damage that might be wrought if action is not taken. And in this sense, we can think about defense as both defense and offense, right? Because as Modestin says in the article I referred to before beginning the lecture, very often, especially in anti-mining resistance movements that are taking place in Oaxaca, specifically southern Oaxaca, around gold extraction, they're playing with the politics of time. They're seeking, at the very least, to slow this down, to get environmental impact assessment procedures enacted, to have proper consultation. People can have an array of positions around mining, and to be sure, anti-mining doesn't just equal Indigenous land defender, right? Some Indigenous peoples may see the benefit of these things, but what they object to is this lack of consultation, this lack of governance from a local level as well. So here, I guess the meaning of land is really important. And the term that's used in Spanish, which is obviously a lingua franca across Indigenous languages, because it is a European language, and it is, for some people, either their first or their second language. Despojo is a word that's used a lot. So we've got something about luchas sociales contra megaproyectos en Mexico, and there were different speakers. It happened a few years ago, and it was all about gas exploration, and featured representatives from the Frente de Pueblos en Defensa de la Tierra y el Agua, Morelos, Puebla, Tlaxcala. So that's a very well-known front of defenders of earth and water across the states of Morelos, Puebla, and Tlaxcala. Hopefully we can talk a little bit about that in a moment. But they speak of despojo, all forms of extractivism, as being despojo, yeah? Literal stripping and exploiting of land, but also dispossession of people and territory. What are the meanings of land that inhere here? Well, land encompasses a way of life. It's actually one's workplace. People like to think that our workplace is offices or lecture halls that we don't want to come to. But you know, if you're someone who works within local agriculture or in fishery, that is your workplace. Placedness is really important to ways of being and doing in relations. For those who use the term territory, very often they're alluding to spaces of quite non-capitalist relations, and also memories of resistances over time, including for those in Isthmus of Oaxaca. Because even there, let's say, the Zapotec, and then in the sort of Sierra of Oaxaca, had resisted not only the Spaniards, but the Aztecs. They resisted absorption into 2 empires. So they have a long history of resistance and memory of resistance, and also ways of doing and being. And so we'll talk here about the place of comunalidad, which you can frame as communal effort, communal work, and cooperation, but is also something that draws distinctly from Indigenous cosmovisiones. So in their discourses and in their actions, they're against territorial reorganization from above, which is very inherent to state and extra state plans for special economic zones and in plans for mega projects. They're against despojo. 3 mega projects touched upon today are the grounds of considerable struggle, or have been. So here's something that was a post on social media. I remember, especially when AMLO first came to power, and he was talking about how he represented the cuarta transformación, the fourth transformation, that he, in a kind of messianic way, like he was the promised Messiah, you know, to continue the revolutionary tradition, yeah, to pick up on the failures of the Mexican Revolution, that his political program would represent a fourth stage of a great transformation, right? When land defenders say that AMLO's fourth transformation and his National Guard, which is the federal army, promotes projects of death, and that they, as defenders, are defending life, it is not a metaphor. This was the case with previous governments, whether or not it mattered that these projects were pushed by Morena or el PRIAN. So PRIAN is like a cheeky conglomerate of the initials of pretty much those two main parties that I mentioned before, PAN and PRI. But for people who struggle from below in these particular frontiers of territorial defense, they are the same entity. And so too, for them, is Morena, or by a range of private interests, including transnational companies. So there's a lot of interest, right, of Canada, Brazil, China as well. I think, obviously, the US, and then for those who service the construction of infrastructure, countries in Europe that have been vying for, you know, gaining from these sorts of mega projects. The projects of death discourse can be understood, if you want to turn to Foucault, as a reverse discourse, because the developmentalist, and one could say neo-indigenous gaze, sees a lot of promise in dispossession, touted as opportunity, the creation of jobs, livelihood, yeah? But for those who struggle from below, these are policies of extermination, and they are often accompanied by some violence by state actors, such as the National Guard, right? Is that sowing life, sembrando la vida? That's actually an agricultural support program that AMLO had brought into place when he gained power. And it's funny, the use of language here, isn't it? Are they the hope of Mexico? La Esperanza de Mexico, again, a slogan of AMLO's. A Mexico that does not recognize the peoples. Never again a Mexico without us, said the Zapatisters. Few study this in detail or understand that bargaining with life and death is not simply a rhetorical twist. These mega projects mean death in a literal sense, also of biodiversity. By contrast, land gives life. It may not be the bio-necropolitics the way many theorists frame it, but such projects are certainly colonialism. Yo prefiero la vida. I prefer life. So land, taking a historical view and picking up maybe on some initial concepts that I brought into place with the first image on the first slide. Okay, land has long been a central way of organizing for Indigenous peoples in Mexico. Central also in the 2010 to 2020 Mexican Revolution, and its slogans of Tierra y Libertad, land and freedom. And also I mentioned before, La Tierra es de quien la trabaja, the land is of who works it. Emiliano Zapata was central to these efforts, and obviously a hero and martyr of the revolution, and still has latterly, within historical memory, continued to be an image for those Indigenous people who had been formerly allocated as peons on grand estates, yeah, haciendas, you might have heard that term before, and called peasants, underdeveloped, yeah. Post-revolution, there were reforms in the 30s enacted under the progressive government of Lázaro Cárdenas, but that was the last time anything progressive happened in Mexico. So AMLO touted that there hadn't been a leftist government in Mexico for like over 70 years, right? But he's no Lázaro Cárdenas. Lázaro Cárdenas created a new communal land scheme and regime of property relations that defined territory in the country. And this is where we get the term ejidos. Zapata, decades hence, still continues to inspire and obviously was formational in the emergence of neo-zapatismo. That's why some people call it new zapatismo. That is the Ejército Zapatista de Liberación Nacional, the National Liberation Army of the Zapatistas, because of those very unfulfilled promises of the revolution and the threat to land and communal systems, but the proposal especially, and then the enactment of the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, represented, which was formulated in 1992 and enacted in 1994. So it's an agreement between, or it was an agreement that's been replaced by another agreement, but it's still a free trade agreement. But one thing that's very significant in NAFTA is that it's between the parties of Mexico, Canada, and the United States, right? It's got a lot of implications. But Article 27, this is a change that happened even before the passing of NAFTA. It allowed for, it prepared the way for NAFTA. It altered an element that was key in the Constitution, which was formed through the revolution. Yeah, so that Constitution was formed in 1917. So Article 27 was a reform that was enacted between 92 and 93. And it sought to erode and eventually dispense with the ejido system that I referred to earlier. And this occurred in the context of priista power and the influx of neoliberalism in Mexico. So once Article 27 of the Constitution was modified between 1992 and 1993 as a necessary precondition for entry into force of NAFTA, 3 other laws aimed at promoting investment of private capital throughout the national territory came into being: the mining law, the national waters law, and foreign investment law. With the first, mining activity is recognized as preferred and of public utility, thereby validating that those companies who had the authorization through a concession from the federal executive arm of government to take advantage of the minerals present in the subsoils would automatically have the right to request the expropriation of the land on which this activity was to be carried out. So this is a radical change. With the second, this gives way to the privatization of water sources, citing through Article 20 of the Constitution the possibility that the nation assign the right to exploit, use, and extract water to third parties through the legal status of the concession. Finally, with the third, the previous limits or restrictions on the investment of foreign capital in Mexico were overturned. This permitted the entry of mining and other mega projects to accelerate. And I did talk a bit before about the ultimacy in power in that first kind of decade of the 2000s in the supposed turn to democracy, right? When the ruling party of 71 years lost power and we saw a center-right government come in power, and people voted for that government simply because they wanted an alternative. But that gave rise to 2 6-year periods of presidents that were from that same party. In particular, we can talk about Vicente Fox, the first president of PAN coming to power, and Felipe Calderón. It was under Felipe Calderón, who assumed power at the end of Vicente Fox's period, that the war on drugs was initiated and agreed to with the United States. This has resulted in a mass displacement over time, particularly of people, and incredible levels of violence. So I don't have my laptop out, but I was reading more recently an update on just how many people have disappeared in the country since that time, since 2006, since the beginning of the war on drugs. And it's something like 90,000 have disappeared and something like 140,000 have been killed. So, you know, Mexico always touted itself as democratic, an exception to those countries of the Southern Cone, for example, that had dictatorships or military juntas, but they always had elections every 6 years, and even with the turn to democracy, got even more democratic. But, you know, the devil's in the detail here. This is more people disappeared than under any dictatorship. So The violence was a manifestation of contention over territory between cartels, often in rural areas, for example, in the southern state of Guerrero, and also its neighboring state, Michoacán, but also Jalisco and other states in the north and the Gulf region, that were being cleared for poppy harvesting and distribution, that is opium, right? Such territories have strategic import for drug production and exportation to the US. And this particularly began to take on this character with the move from Colombia as being the center of that to Mexico. Now, within territory, we see a range of vested interests and even de facto powers that question the territorial control of the drug economy. We see this in parallel to the rise of neoliberalism and extractivism and also organized crime. These processes are kind of intricately interlinked. So we see an imbrication of state, private, and organized crime and narco interests over territory, all within the war on drugs, which is a kind of form of armed neoliberalism. So this is a very important term to bring into account. Here is a map where we can see from 2013 to 2024, the territories that are dominated by particular cartels in Mexico. And there have been changes because there's always like lines of contention and even intercartel warfare. But with the war on drugs that started in 2006 and really wasn't very much changed even by the president who came after Calderon, we see a huge deployment of the military to these zones, yeah, in an effort to, quote unquote, break the cartels. But very often cartels operate in kind of political vacuums or in spaces where there's a lot of deprivation and there are very few employment opportunities for people. People may be drawn into drug economies. They may also respect drug lords because such drug lords will build churches and schools and do the sorts of things that the state is supposed to do. So it's a matter of some complexity, but we can see that territories are set spaces of massive contention, often violent, and also that complicates the picture for people who are struggling from below for defense of their own land, right? Whether it be against organized crime, whether it be against the influx of narco traffickers into their land, or whether it be against the state using the military to, you know, in the name of putting down drug trafficking, but actually using that same deployment to crack down on activists. So after Calderon, we saw the return of the ruling party, but supposedly with a new brand. And so they call themselves the New PRI, and they have this very good-looking kind of soap opera star president that was young. And I don't know, he had nothing of substance to say in the electoral debates before he assumed presidency. Some also feel that both his predecessor and himself played with the numbers, and that Andrés Manuel Obrador should have been in power then as well, that there was corruption at that electoral level, the paying of people to vote for these candidates from the dominant parties. But under Enrique Peña Nieto, that violence brought into being through the war on drugs only accelerated and ramped up in some cases. State complicity in the same really became a focus of attention, particularly around the case of the 45 disappeared students from Guerrero, from a teacher's training college. And these are mainly like young Indigenous men, right? That were training to become secondary school teachers. They, early on in Enrique Peña Nieto's 6-year period in government, were kidnapped, and their remains haven't been found, but it is supposed, and there's increasing evidence, that it was under the direction of the federal army. Yes. And so this became a huge issue in Mexico. There were mass movements for justice, politicization of military necropolitics, the use of the military as a tool of political death and targeting of communities forged by the security state only became more evident. And this really delegitimized the claims that Peña Nieto was going to bring out New Mexico. That he represented a new PRI, a new face of PRI, that he was the Mexican moment, because even Time magazine put him on its cover in his first year of presidency and said that he represented the Mexican moment, because Mexican national growth apparently was at its all-time high then. People became incredibly fed up. So that's what hartazgo means, both with El PRI and the other main party. I haven't mentioned El PRD, which is the Partido Revolucionario Democrático, because it's never actually attained federal power, but it is one of those third parties. And AMLO, of course, labeled them all the mafia of power. So he had tried to get elected during all this period, right? From Calderon on. But because of electoral fraud or like barely able to break even with the numbers to get a majority, he never got into power in those previous periods. Another factor that really mobilized people were the proposed presidential reforms under Enrique Peña Nieto, such as the energy reform, key legislation that would permit further private investment and ownership of infrastructure projects. And also the education reform, which really mobilized the teachers' movement in Oaxaca. So Oaxaca's a really interesting place politically, right? All of these senses of being fed up, of the state being a violator, only emboldened AMLO and gave him fuel to be able to construct a discourse of political legitimacy in what had already been delegitimized amongst the other parties. So the results of the 2018 election are quite stunning, because it's an example of political success, the likes of which you see in very few parts of the world. So Andrés Manuel López Obrador came to power with a 52% majority. And if you look at the rival parties, they trail him by a substantial amount. And this changed the political map. No longer did you have even strongholds of the other two dominant parties, really, across Mexico. The vast majority of states and also municipalities swung to Morena. So who is AMLO? Well, and what is he about? Well, he promised to renew and rescind private mining and other energy industry concessions. He appealed to national values, honesty. He spoke like an ordinary man, something that people could relate to. He pledged social programs for the poor, and he openly critiqued both neoliberalism and Donald Trump. AMLO was in opposition, as I said, for many years, and out of that, he formed the Movement for National Regeneration Party, which is known as Morena. But this party actually came from disaffected parts of the dominant parties. He started off in the 70s as the head of the Instituto Indigenista of Tabasco. Now, Indigenismo in Mexico has an interesting dimension to it. There's more to the name than just indigenous. Indigenism, as a state project in Mexico, particularly post-revolution, is part of that corporatist project to absorb radical popular energies, to domesticate them. And as such, the idea of indigenous claims and indigenous identities that it both legitimates and seeks to uphold are very static, culturalist, essentialistic notions, folkloric even, whereby indigenous people merely serve to provide color to the nation state. But when it comes to issues such as land, they're talking out of turn, right? Instead, they need to come up into the discourse of what it means to be indigenous, right? So gestures towards state inclusion of indigenous peoples, including through the poverty alleviation programs, simultaneously see and project indigenous peoples as needing development. And that is another side of indigenous. And that is what López Obrador has represented since the beginning of his political career. So he hasn't really changed. We can give him that consistency, but he is simultaneously a neo-developmentalist and indigenist. The Zapatistas long warned us about him, that he wasn't any true alternative, but rather part of the mafia of power itself. So in this 6-year term, we've seen a lot of political repositioning and changes in the elite. This is why I call it a new hegemony. But some of it is, like Morena, is made up of fragments of the other parties. So it's a bit of a strange beast. Pledges against corruption, but the diminishing of the civil sphere, and a kind of turn or even return to patrimonialism and presidentialism. AMLO holds mañaneras, that is morning programs where he supposedly speaks to the common people. I don't know if they're a must-see. The logic of sacrifice really enters into discourse for national good. But it's questionable whether it's actually anti-neoliberal or post-neoliberal, right? What does this mean for los pueblos y sus territorios? Are they the casualties and necessary sacrifice in the name of the nation and the people? He has continued in the spirit of previous parties to push for mega projects and mega scale development, working on the logics of the laws of his predecessors, and also partaking of a long history of territorial designs from above. And strangely enough, he has been compared to the oligarch I referred to before, Porfirio Diaz. A very interesting thing happened halfway through his presidency. He turned to the King of Spain and the Pope and demanded that they grant an apology to Mexican peoples for colonization. You can imagine that that wasn't very well received. They rejected it. They said, this is completely like out of context, and what responsibility do we have for something that happened 500 years ago? Well, that's a moot point. But because of that, a lot of political disagreement erupted, and people who wanted to challenge AMLO, including from the left and from below, said, you know, forget about asking the Rey de España, the King of Spain, for an apology, or the Pope. We want the apology from you. You know, like the things that you're talking about conquest and extractivism that you're all about really are continuing. So the real apology needs to come from within. And he made gestures for that, but very much appropriated what we have seen actually globally as a moment of sorry, right? So there's a new book coming out that I'm endorsing, by the way, both by talking about it, but also I'll be on the blurb, and one of my students has a chapter in it. She's brilliant, Ines Duran Matute. It's called Oh Sorry. If I get time, I'll show you the webpage for the book. So he traveled to the Yucatan, to Mayan territory, to officially ask for sorry from community leaders, and they rejected that. Because of these long-term designs that he is just taking up on as well and further pushing ahead, right? In the Mayan region, we saw from the very beginning, including under Porfirio Diaz in the pre-revolutionary period, an hacienda system in the cultivation of enequén, which is a kind of, what do you call it in English? Well, it's a grass, you know, and it's used as a textile. And in that region, an immense amount grows, and it was always, land was seen for that productive value and was already expropriated, right? But also the Mayan region has been looked to build up the assembly plant sector, that is the maquiladora, kind of indentured labor system of manufacture, and, you know, part of the sort of free trade logics of neoliberalism itself. And the Mayan region has also seen as being beneficial to tourist industries, yeah? And so the Mayan train really partakes of a very long dream to go into these territories and further garner economic benefits and seemingly generate labor opportunities. but the conditions are quite dire working conditions for people who work without unions, for people who work in conditions that are sort of very exploitative. The Mayan train is a proposal that thought to construct an entire train line that would be going through all of this territory, Mayan territory, supposedly to develop the region. Oaxaca as well has been within the crosshairs for a long time, geopolitically and economically as a strategic space. From the 19th century on, we had seen amongst different politicos the dream of uniting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans for trade. Lately, this dream was reconfigured by proposals by AMLO for so-called curtains of development to contain as well migration that comes from Central America and from South America that's seen as problematic to both Mexico and the United States. So what we see on the northern border and the politics of so-called illegal migration from a new US lens is also mirrored in the southern border. And in fact, there's a lot more violence that occurs down there that gets unseen. So his proposal is, well, these people are migrating for a reason, let's give them jobs. But it's quite a cynical term because it's like, I'm doing this because basically the US says this is the way it should be, right? I'm creating a new labor system, but also allowing the occupation of this territory, which is already territory of Indigenous peoples, for the installation of mining and extractivist industries, industrial parks. Yeah. So these are known not only as curtains of development, that is to contain south and north movement of migrants, but also as development poles, the promise of infrastructure and energy to modernize, to urbanize, and so on. Such plans and actions for mega projects precede AMLO, to be sure, but they're intensified. And the antagonisms around them are amplified by the contradictions of his leftist populism. And here we can look at the work of Ernesto Laclau to understand populism and Svampa to understand the contradictions of leftist populism. So there are three foci, right? Mayan territory, that is the Yucatán, Campeche, which have already seen struggles against GMO soy and monocrops, including with the presence of Monsanto, which is a GMO multinational, the clearing of land for the same, as well as the construction of wind farms and pig farms. You might remember the swine flu, that arose out of that context. So many groups have opposed those plans. And now the Mayan train. Oaxaca, as we see this week, has been a space of contention around wind farms, also called renewables, but also mining, and the mega project that's known as the Trans-Isthmus Corridor to connect that very narrow parcel of territory from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean as an alternative to the Panama Canal. And then Morelos. Okay, so Morelos is a site for the construction of a gas pipeline. And it's also where Zapata came from, right? So Nahuatl-speaking peoples. This gas pipeline and its accompanying set of thermoelectric power plants will straddle three states that are on very delicate territory because it's volcanic territory. It's also subject to a lot of seismic activity and could be disruptive and result in disasters. So there's a number of reasons for why people are getting behind these efforts, particularly for the, underneath the campaigns of the Frente Popular that I mentioned before as well, the FPDTA, that opposes this Morelos comprehensive project. So it's very interesting to see the arising of these new antagonisms. Now, Moresin, in the article about anti-mining in Oaxaca, notes that not all mining exploration or proposed activities actually result in social struggle and resistance to the same. But there are key moments where that is happening. And so it's interesting to dwell on how and why, and also in which ways people are constructing networks and on what basis. We see this from below and from the left. There are two bodies such as the Congreso Nacional Indígena and the Consejo Indígena de Gobierno they have been subalternized in the current conjuncture, coyuntura, under AMLO. And so new antagonisms are emerging. Likewise, there's cooperation and network building across community contexts and among struggles between academics and community leaders, schools and environmentalists, human rights workers, and in alternative media outlets and via community radio and other media within local Indigenous spaces, and in concert with national groups and transnational ones, including the Network Against Mining, the Tren Maya, and the M4. There is little space within mainstream media, however, or political parties to articulate these resistances. And even AMLO himself has accused them of being conservative and associated with the right, which is a very strange kind of way to frame them because they're anything but. So it's important to think about the struggles, what they articulate, both in terms of how they articulate between actors to amass networks, but also what they articulate, how they speak back, what language they use. Yo prefiero la vida, agua para vivir, tierra para trabajar y seguridad para vivir sin miedo. Water to live, earth to work, and security to live without fear because of the faces of violence that I've spoken to already. And the gasoducto, the gas pipeline in Morelos that was being opposed, and the thermoelectric plant in Huexca, in a village of Morelos, is something that erupted in some violence, including when Manuel López Obrador had come to power and supposedly was consulting with community and got approval for that. The next day, one of the prominent leaders by the name of Samir was killed. Samir Flores. And so Samir has become like this new martyr as well, and is sometimes put alongside in murals and so on with the image of Zapata, because he's also Nahuatl speaking. So it's very interesting to look at the rhetorics of the campaigns, how they posit their struggle on the capital life conflict in opposition to accumulation and dispossession by accumulation. What does it mean to say that such mega projects are projects of death? What does it mean to say, I prefer life? I prefer the mountain, I prefer the river. What does it mean when a country person, comunero, is asked why they resist? And they respond for life itself. So let's continue to look at activist articulations and representations. Here you can see Samir Flores that I mentioned before, including how they articulate among themselves and internally, the analysis that they make of mega projects, that we need to take them seriously, and the critiques and alternatives they propose to these forms of so-called development. And there are differences. So Morrison says it doesn't, and these anti-extractivist resistances don't just spontaneously erupt, right? And they don't happen just anywhere and everywhere. They happen where people have already been politicized, or maybe they have a social memory of struggle, or maybe they get politicized by other movements, such as the movement against violence, because these are cross-cutting struggles, right? Perhaps they've never been activists before, but they're emboldened. So we have to look at not just the conjuncture of AMLO being in power and the sort of flattening of the left, but also the particular sites and the people that organize and why, how they become politicized. Within that subalternization, antagonism, and then insubordination framework that someone such as Modenesi, whose text I featured in week 3, talks about in explaining from a kind of Marxist point of view as well, how and why resistances arise. So we'll go to Oaxaca tomorrow. The Istmo, we'll be talking about the readings and the longer history of resistance and memory. We might be able to build in, if anyone's seen it, the film Hija de la Laguna, Daughter of the Lake, because activists have used that documentary in their communities, even though it's taking place in northern Peru, right? So I'll see you in Oaxaca and in class. Thank you. Thank you.